What's up, guys? It's Dan. I wanted to bring the Abomination to you today because it's one of the classes I probably get the most questions about lately. And it all stems around from, really, is he underpowered? I don't find a place to use him. Where do you fit him in? Um, you know, and really, I think primarily that comes from a lot of inexperienced players and not knowing where to make him fit if you can't bring the Vestal, since she won't run with him, and his party composition is limited because he won't really, you can't put him in with the religious characters. So I figured I'd go through a breakdown on what I recommend, and some of the party compositions I recommend and who he pairs well with, and kind of a play style for him, because he is really probably the most complex character in Darkest Dungeon. So we'll kind of start in general where he fits in and where I feel that he plays best at. So personally, he can run in slot 1 or slot 2, where I think he runs really well. In slot 1, you can favor this trinket here, the Protective Padlock, where he will have prot and be a little more tankish. Running him in slot 1, it does have a few challenges, and that is no manacles, no beast spile. And as you go back through here, those are really two of the most utilized skills that you will use when you're running him. So if you do run him in slot 1, you know that you're kind of limiting yourself. He can be pretty tanky. However, I don't know that it's enough to offset the weaknesses of not being able to utilize the stun or the blight. So my recommendation is really to run him in slot 2, and typically I always will pair him with a Hellion. So reason why in the Hellion, I mean, you guys know that's one of the classes I feel that is probably the best. And if you notice on all of his attacks that he does here, no slot 4, no slot 4, no slot 4, no slot 4, no slot 4. So with the Abomination, you're looking at somebody who's already limited to causing your party more stress, and then he can't hit slot 4, which means those are typically either damage dealers or stress dealers, and a lot of the high crit or high stress enemies come from slot 4. So not being able to hit slot 4 means you have to offset him with either a Houndmaster, a Hellion, really, or an Arbalist. Those are the 3 best, I would say, for high damage. So that's why I recommend the Hellion here. Now, there's a ton of different party compositions you can play with him, so this is one of my recommendations, and I'll kind of explain why. With Iron Swan on the Hellion, you can hit, obviously, slot 4. And then with the Occultist, he can bring those mobs forward and also clear corpses that can get in the way of the Abomination being able to either not hit somebody in slot 4 or making it awkward for some of your party to not be able to hit someone. The other person I recommend is the Grave Robber. So the Grave Robber, and the reason that I recommend her, and another reason I recommend the Hellion, is the crit. So because of the way that the Abomination causes so much stress to your party, in most circumstances, not all, that is one of the reasons you want to bring the Grave Robber. So with the Grave Robber, not only does she has Gallows Humor, which should be able to reduce quite a bit of stress. Also, you look at the amount of crit that she has, the crit modification on Thrown Dagger of 12%. I mean, you've got 6% here with Pick to the Face. The lunge is 12%. She has a way to help mitigate some of the stress by the amount of crits she can deal. Same thing with a Hellion to an extent, but the other person you could bring is the Arbalist. So this is my first recommendation. The second one would be to take out, I don't even know if I have one. There she is. The second recommendation would be to swap here and then take the Arbalist in the 4th slot. Run it as high crit trinkets as you can with these two, and that should help offset some of the stress damage. Now, you also will have to change a lot of your combat skills in that case. It's probably to wound care, because you're going to have anybody to be able to heal. So you have to bring additional food, and it really kind of makes it awkward. So I really feel that that's part of the reason the Abomination is underutilized. Part of it is a misunderstanding, but part of it is truly that he's kind of difficult to play and to fit into some of the quote-unquote meta party compositions. So now that you kind of know who he plays best with and why, we'll move into some of his combat skills. So looking at his combat skills, obviously he has the human form and he has the beast form. So my recommendation is that you really want to try and play him in human as much as possible, unless you think that you have the possibility to kill something by changing to beast. So the human form, you're going to be able to stun third row, which is pretty strong. So that's going to be a lot of his opening attacks, are going to be using the manacles to stun third row. From there, you're probably going to be blighting rows 2 and 3, especially if there's a prot mob there. If you're going to keep him in a human form. If you're going to switch into the beast form, you have the option, obviously, that you can rage, rake, and really, because he's so versatile, it really is going to change the trinkets that, you know, you really, the compositions you want to utilize. So my recommendations are here. We'll go into that in a second, but based off how you're going to play him, you have to trinket accordingly. So there isn't really a best trinket recommendation. There's simply, based off if you're going to switch to beast form more often, then you need to trinket accordingly with probably a little more stress reduction and a little more high crit, high damage. One of the huge advantages to him is his speed. I mean, it's awesome. It starts off at 9, and if you get quirks that help support that, I think it would be, you know, he can be extremely strong with how fast that he goes. But with that and the amount of stress that he causes, a lot of people tend to favor bringing the Jester, which is, it's another option, but bringing the Jester doesn't necessarily offset the stress. You really want to let the Abomination offset his own stress with stress heal as much as possible, and then trying to rely on your camps rather than bringing a person to just mitigate his stress that he's causing. So as you kind of go through your combat skills, really some of the strongest ones are going to be Rage and Rake, probably, that you'll utilize. You'll use Rake to finish off the front and second row. Obviously is an AoE attack, but Rage is probably one of the better ones. Speed or Slam, depending on, you know, if you need to move somebody down in speed, if they're a high dodge, maybe on like dog fights, things like that. But one of the weaknesses of the Abomination, before you use something like, you know, if you're going after a high dodge character, you should know that he is not the strongest when it comes to accuracy. He's not leper blind, but he isn't the most accurate character. So, and if you look at a lot of his accuracy bases, 100, not that it's low, but these are significantly higher in human form than when he changes to beast form. So that's another thing to consider. So kind of moving on from the combat skills, I mean, that part is pretty simplified. As you're in human form, you're going to typically try and stun and manage through stuns and blights. And then obviously healing yourself when you need to, and then changing to beast form depending on the fight. And if you can finish somebody off, that would be my recommendation. Moving on to just quirks. We'll go to quirks and kind of touch on them in general. Most people assume I'm just going to stick with, you know, Slugger and the melee damage type, precise striker, combat skills, or quirks, and that's fine. You can, but my recommendation is probably the top one is Photomania, and not incurring any additional stress to him, because he doesn't need any help with it. I mean, he stresses himself out enough, and he can stress the party out enough. So my recommendation is to mitigate stress first and foremost, then go after crit, which will also help mitigate stress, and then go after damage. So really, Photomania is probably one of the top ones. Look at Precise Striker, and then, you know, overall Slugger would probably be a good one. But, you know, quick reflexes, he's already got a ton of speed. That's one we considered. On guard, we typically would consider, again, he really doesn't struggle in speed, and his dodge is okay. You could run it, but really you want to try and offset a few of his weaknesses, and I think Photomania really helps that. And then by utilizing more crit, typically he can reduce even more of the stress that he's going to take. So in moving down to the trinkets, this is really where it gets complex. The surgical gloves is a good one, I think, that you can run on him when you are going to change to beast mode, and you know that you're going to look at, you know, really going after it, being more aggressive with damage, but you have to try and offset some of the stress he'll incur by you know, bringing the right party members. So surgical gloves is a good one. I really don't favor bringing any of the trinkets that drive additional stress for him. So, you know, a lot of the very rare trinkets, I really don't think he needs any help getting any more stress. Personally, I just think it's a gold sink, especially if you aren't at a point like, I don't want to say like where I am in the game now, but if you aren't at a point where you can, gold is not a bottleneck, I wouldn't recommend bringing anything that brings additional stress. It just makes your life harder. But Ancestor's Pen's another one that you could consider if you can manage that because of the crit offset that he brings. And looking at his own trinkets, one that's often overlooked is the one really that I have on now. So if you look at the Protective Padlock, he has enough speed to offset himself. That prod is pretty strong. And then, you know, these are also pretty good. There's not as much HP, but 10% damage is good, and the 3 additional speed, it's almost guaranteed that he'll go first every turn, allowing you to get a definite stun in before one of those stress characters can maybe deal damage in the 3rd row. And then the Restraining Padlock is one that, it has value, but if you aren't constantly spamming into beast mode and you're being selective, like I talked about before, you really don't need it. I'd say the Lock of Fury is probably better. And then the Padlock of Transference is one that the longer you're in human form, the more you benefit from this, and this is probably my top recommendation. So I would say Padlock of Transference, Protective Padlock, depending on how you're going to run them, or Surgical Gloves are really my top 3 recommendations. But there's a ton of different ways you can play him. I just don't really recommend giving him any additional stress by bringing those plus 10% stress trinkets. So moving away from the trinkets and looking at camping skills, the Quickening's a great one, but we've already talked about that his speed's pretty damn good, and I mean, you can do that. It'll almost guarantee that you'll go first. Psych Up, again, is okay, but you're increasing your stress. And then the same thing with Anger Management. The time that Anger Management really is valuable, though, is if you want to be a little more risky, is popping Anger Management on yourself and then utilizing Gallows Humor to try and offset. Hopefully, you'll get that stress reduction right back. So that's one way you can use that, and that will actually cost you, it costs you 7 time in your camp, but that's a way you can kind of mitigate some of that stress. It's a little more risky, but it's something that I tend to utilize quite a bit. If you aren't going to bring a healer, you've got to remember that a lot of your camping skills are going to have to be adjusted, which is probably, this would be the recommendation I would give you if you aren't going to bring a healer. If you are, I would probably say this would be your setup here. As far as any of the diseases you can take, really I'd say you could consider the fits for the speed bonus, but it's not really worth it. Rabies, his accuracy's a little low, and you don't want to have to trinket for accuracy. So I would say in champion level dungeons, I wouldn't recommend Rabies at that point. It does have a good damage offset, but it's just not worth the accuracy that he kind of needs in order to be able to hit reliably, especially on some of the boss characters or high dodge characters. It can be really stressful on your party to run into 4 dogs and him not be able to hit because he has Rabies. So with that, guys, that's the Abomination. Thanks for your patience as I've been releasing these videos. And I apologize for the length of this one, but as complex as the Abomination is, I wanted to give it the time I felt it deserved. So those are my recommendations, and what I'd say would help you play the Abomination better. So if you have any recommendations, throw them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See ya.